The year was 1776, and it was July, probably the 4th, but nobody knew for sure. The location was a secret outpost somewhere deep in the heart of America. And there, hidden amongst the trees, were a few hundred American soldiers ready to defend their homeland from the mightiest army in the world. For days already, there had been horrific fighting. Both the Americans and the English had suffered heavy losses, but the English kept coming wave after bloody wave. The war raged on. Muskets roared, cannons boomed. Soldiers fought on horseback, on foot, with war hammers, swords, javelins, bows, and arrows. But mostly, it was the muskets and cannons that did most of the damage. The Americans had taken losses in the hundreds, but still they held. It seemed the outpost would stand strong. Then suddenly, the unthinkable happened. An entire squad of American soldiers cleared and took a hill, taking out dozens of English, only to turn and see something that made their blood run cold. One of their own was down there in the valley, and he was locked in mortal combat with a single English soldier. They watched in horror as the two fighters dueled back and forth, each man landing blow after blow. The Americans couldn't just leave their comrade to die, but if they charged in, they would likely be wiped out by the English reinforcements pouring through the gap in the hills. Then, when it seemed like all hope was lost, the leader of the squad took aim and fired his musket. The English sword fighter fell to the ground clutching his chest, blood gushing from the hole in his uniform. The Americans charged into the fray, taking out the rest of the English soldiers with ease. Then, just as quickly as the battle had started, it was over. The Americans stood amidst the carnage, exhausted, thirsty, and hungry for more. But no one was coming. The attackers were done. Maybe this was it. Perhaps the outpost would stand strong and the English would retreat. But then the unthinkable happened again. Through the smoke and haze, the Americans heard screams, blood-curdling screams. Then they saw it. A line of Americans was being flung left and right. It looked like a giant pendulum, and it kept swinging. Then, as the pendulum reached its peak, they could see him. King George, the most powerful man in the world, stood atop the hill, a colossus 10 feet tall, roaring like a lion, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. In his hand, he held a flaming sword that dripped molten lava. King George was killing his own soldiers by the hundreds, but he didn't care. Nothing could stop him. He was a one-man army, and he was on the march. The Americans watched in horror as the mighty king led his army ever closer. The men knew they couldn't win a battle against such a powerful foe, not while he was mounted on his high horse. The only hope was to lure him into a trap. But just then, in the distance, another roar was heard. The men turned and saw George Washington riding towards them. The great general was a commanding 7 feet tall and built like an oak tree. Behind him rode the rest of the American commanders. Washington dismounted and, with a few words to his fellow generals, ran towards the outpost, dodging cannon fire and charging soldiers alike. With his trusty axe that he cut the cherry tree down with on his hip, multiple black powder pistols adorned his combat vest, and he held his trusty long rifle in his hand. He addressed the men, offering words of encouragement and telling them the plan. Then, with a final nod, disappeared into the ranks. Moments later, the first line of red coats reached the wall. Washington had his men load the mortar with a new special kind of airburst explosive. As the battle raged on around him, Washington calmly directed the men, making sure they were in position and offering words of wisdom where possible. The men adored George Washington for his charisma, his fearlessness, and his exceptional skill in warfare. King George was about to find out all about that. The towering beast, nearly breathing fire and spitting acid, known as King George, breached the threshold. Washington gave the cue. The men lit the mortar. One by one, they fired off a volley of the new explosive, boom, boom, boom. Red, white, and bright blue colors burst in the air overhead, lighting up the whole sky. The mortar kept firing all through the night. The men start raising the American flag all around the outpost. Francis Scott Key stands on the walls of the outpost and starts loudly singing the Star-Spangled Banner to fireworks going off overhead. Completely distracted by the colorful explosions, King George didn't see George Washington leading his rebels in an all-out attack on the Mad King. They immediately started circling the distracted king and firing and stabbing at him. Over and over and over again, the mighty King George fell. To the ground, his legs buckled and he collapsed. That is when George Washington dealt the final blow. With his axe, he chopped down King George's legs, like the cherry tree so long ago. On his final swing to take the Mad King down, Washington yelled out, "I cannot tell a lie." And with that, the king was down. America had won its freedom, its independence. And so that is why, all these hundreds of years later on, every 4th of July, we light up the sky with reminders that we are the land of the free and the home of the brave.